Here in northern India, members of the Free the Slaves organization have swung into action. Things have to move quickly before the factory owner finds out about the raid. The activists find 24 boys on the ground. They were lured here from their villages by human traffickers and enslaved.
We thought we could earn money, but all we got was abuse.
We worked from 8 in the evening until 8 in the morning, and if we made the slightest mistake, they beat us.
After a 200-year struggle, slavery is now officially outlawed in all nations the world over. But instances of slavery repeatedly occur. Rapidly growing populations, poverty, and a lack of judicial systems have created a system of modern slavery. Slavery is a term from the dark days of the past, but we know that it still exists in individual cases around the world. We hear enough reports of forced prostitution here in Germany, but those are society's no-go areas. And we wouldn't dream of buying products made by slaves, would we? Few people realize what goes on under the plastic roofs in the Spanish province of Almeria. Greenhouses cover an area equivalent to 80,000 soccer pitches here. Fruit and winter vegetables are exported to other European countries. Much of the produce goes to German supermarkets. The Finnish graphic artist Ville Tietovainen took a look inside the greenhouses and behind the scenes of a seemingly ideal world.
I now have the feeling that I commit an offence by just entering a supermarket, as if I were a criminal myself.
10 years ago, Tietovainen travelled extensively through Spain and Morocco. He met a lot of people and heard their stories. Stories of illegal immigrants who were looking for a better life, but ended up as slaves in the greenhouses of Almeria. He's written a moving graphic novel called Invisible Hands. The boat crossing costs 2,500 euros. The people run up debts under the illusion they'll soon be able to earn enough to pay them off. They risk their lives crossing the narrow strait between northern Africa and Spain in boats that aren't seaworthy. For many, the dream of a better life already ends here in tragedy. Those who do manage to reach Europe often end up as slaves in the huge fruit and vegetable plantations in Almeria.
The illegal workers are housed on waste ground, where greenhouses used to stand. The soil is contaminated with the pesticides, fertilizers, and salt that were sprayed here for decades. They make their huts from things they find on the garbage heap.
Some 40,000 illegal immigrants work here in a parallel world. Escape is almost impossible. If they're caught, they're deported or handed over to the farm operators by the police. The landowners sometimes pay them a measly wage, sometimes nothing at all. Illegal workers have no rights.
Jos ajatellaan sitä ihan Almerian aluetta,
In Almeria, the authorities,
media,
greenhouse owners,
virkavalta
and the media work together.
ja sit nämä viljelijät
They control the media and make sure some things aren't made public.
on yhtä. Media on heidän
They sign
omistuksessaan.
contracts with the local authorities and then regional politicians so that the well-oiled immigrant market continues to function.
Hyvin rasvattua konetta voidaan pitää yllä.
The farms are off limits to strangers. No one wants any witnesses. Tietäväinen distributed disposable cameras and persuaded workers to photograph the situation they were in. Thousands of photos were taken, on which he based his drawings.
Siis viljelijöillä ja ihmisillä.
The landowners and the traffickers have made a deal. Someone puts up money for the crossing. For a Moroccan or North African or people who come from further south, these are huge sums of money. They're supposed to pay off their debts by working. Many take years before they can send any money back home. Some never manage it.
Anyone who's no longer able to work is deported. The workers are forced to spray pesticides without protective clothing. Illnesses are common. Some even die under the hostile plastic roofs. There's no medical aid, not even clean water. The hygiene is atrocious. Nothing to do with the paradise on earth its inhabitants dreamed of.
The Spaniards and the tourists don't get to see the migrants, and the migrants never manage to get away for as long as they live. The authorities make sure of that. The border is always as porous as the need for workers dictates. The farm owners can sell work permits that bind these people to a certain employer, so they can't get away. They're trapped by their debts.
Slavery in modern-day Europe, a continent proud of its humanistic values. Tietäväinen's work caused a huge stir, was translated into a number of languages and won numerous prizes. But did it change anything?
We got a lot of feedback from European politicians. They wanted to know how to get more information. They assured me the issue was receiving priority. They wanted to make sure such things could not occur in Europe. But as far as I know, that was the end of it.
Is slavery part and parcel of a global economy? It exists worldwide, and the reports could fill a library full of graphic novels.
Average consumers don't go there. Maybe they hear rumors, but as long as food is cheap, there's no cause for concern.
Many famous people are buried in London's Westminster Abbey. They include Charles Darwin, Charles Dickens, and many others. The grave of William Wilberforce is also here. In 1807, after 18 years of campaigning and opposing slavery, he finally succeeded. The first law banning the slave trade was passed after a 10-hour parliamentary debate. It's now banned the world over. But what does that mean?
So in the world today, we know there are about 38 million slaves.
We meet Kevin Bales on the Channel Island of Guernsey. The social scientist heads the Wilberforce Institute for the Study of Slavery and Emancipation. Bales is a renowned expert.
When I first learned about modern slavery was back in the 1990s. And I picked up a leaflet at a public event, and this leaflet said, there are millions of slaves in the world today. And I looked at it and I thought, that can't be true. Everyone knows slavery is finished. It finished in the 19th century.
That claim led to years of research. Bales entered a parallel world that he didn't think could possibly even exist.
And that began for me a process of digging into the issue to look at the numbers first. And I discovered it was true. And that led me to see many things that horrified me when I got into the field and began to meet people in slavery. It's a very disturbing world, the world that slaves live in.
There are two basic differences between classic and modern-day slavery. It's now illegal, and yet slaves are cheaper than ever before.
We know this through very clear research that's been done to show that in the past, buying a slave was like buying a major piece of equipment, like a big truck or a tractor or, an investment. And if you bought a slave, you paid a lot of money. It took a long time for them to pay off the investment. And there were insurance policies to protect your slaves because they were worth the investment.
In the south of the US, a slave used to cost the equivalent of up to $30,000 in today's money. Now, in some areas of the world, you can get a slave for just $50. Poverty and overpopulation provide new slaves, and if they're no longer needed, they can just be discarded.
I can think of children that I have seen in Nepal who are used to carry stone. And if they fall down, if they break their leg, they just leave them. They just throw them away because it's too expensive to bring a doctor. It's less expensive to buy another child.
Bales found slavery in many nations around the world. It's become a basic part of a global economy.
Well, there's certainly a connection between modern slavery and the highest ranks of international companies in exactly the same way that there's a connection between modern slavery and each one of us who are consumers. So anyone along the supply chain, and that includes the heads of big companies as well as us, are linked to that slavery.
India likes to be seen as a modern nation. The world's largest democracy with a growing industry and prospering small-scale companies. But behind the facade, you can encounter medieval scenes. Allegedly, there are 17 to 20 million slaves. Local aid organizations refer to 60 million. Many Dalits, the untouchables, traditionally born into slavery in India. Supriya Avasti, an activist with Free the Slaves, is visiting a village community of former slaves. These people got a second chance and now live in freedom. But the aid organization leads an almost hopeless battle against a system of crime, corruption and slavery. In India, slaves can be found in brothels and private homes, rice mills, factories and quarries, on farms, and especially often in brickworks.
The nature of bricklaying is such that people who are working there are entirely in slavery. They're 100% slave. And the reason for this is that this whole industry is huge and is controlled by violence and threat. And in order to control hundreds of people, the slave owners threaten them. They are even violent. They have killed people in slavery in bricklands.
The slaves in the brickworks and other industries often fall victim to debt, sometimes the equivalent of just 10 or 20 euros. Often several generations of entire families are tricked into becoming slaves. Many of them are unable to read or write and have no financial oversight. Bonded labour was banned in India in 1976. But in this rural area, no one seems bothered by that. Corrupt authorities make sure that's the case. Cheap bricks mean cheap factory construction costs and cheap products. Local slavery creates an economy that can produce cheap export goods.
How slavery looks like. How we define slavery is anybody who is held physically, under violence, are not paid or paid below minimum wages. And that's exactly what we witnessed when we were conducting this rescue operation. That people were not paid, they were physically confined, they were under surveillance all the time. The women were sexually abused, the children were beaten, and they were made to work as well.
The organization managed to free more than 4,500 slaves in India from 2013 to 2014 and bring 130 slaveholders to trial. Information sessions like this one aim to warn people of the risk of slavery. But the toughest challenge is to offer prospects to those freed from slavery. Some can return to their villages, but others end up back in captivity. They have no choice. Either they become slaves or they starve.
Every rescue operation is very unpredictable. We do not know what will come out of it, how far the people have come, for how many years they have been in slavery. All we know is that we have to organize them because it's them who could sustain their freedom.
The aid organizations are faced with millions of slaves, and their work is getting harder. The current government has decided to ignore the problem and keep silent about it as much as possible. India sees itself as a modern nation with a reputation to uphold. Slavery just doesn't fit into a 21st century society.
The NGOs that work against slavery around the world, they are very small, but they're also the most effective of all the organizations that do anything about slavery. If you look and say, who is bringing slaves to freedom? Who is freeing slaves? The greatest number of slaves being freed is not by governments, it's by the NGO sector.
Every year, tens of thousands of children in India's poor northeastern states are sent into slavery under the eyes of the authorities. They arrive in so-called children trains. The traffickers receive the equivalent of about 12 euros per child.
The connection of with people in slavery to us in the rich part of the world, there can be several ways that the supply chains connect us, through carpets, through food, through fish, through jewelry, through shoes. There's a lot of products that can come out of India and end up in our lives, including tombstones.
Hej. Jeg vil gerne bede 16 stykker.
Back in wealthy Europe, we've come to Copenhagen to meet Danish journalist Miki Mistrati. He came across a direct link between slave work and a product on our daily shopping list: chocolate.
Well, actually it began in my local supermarket as a consumer. I went down for buying a chocolate bar, and at the supermarket there were 7 chocolate bars. They were actually the same, just with different flavor. And one of the chocolate bar had a fair trade mark. And I was just wondering, okay, you have 7 chocolate bar, one is fair trade. What about the 6 other chocolate bars? Are they on fair trade?
In his search for the invisible hands that harvest the cocoa beans for our chocolate bars, Mistrati traveled to West Africa. Ivory Coast is one of the world's leading cocoa bean producers. Some 80% of the cocoa found in the chocolate sold in European supermarkets comes from here, harvested by child slaves.
They come from even more poor countries, the neighbor countries like Mali, Benin, Burkina Faso, Niger, and all the surrounding countries. So the children comes from countries which are more poor, and this is also the problem in this area.
According to one UNICEF report, some 200,000 children are abducted in West Africa every year. Many become slaves. Illegal slave markets are held in the northern regions of Ivory Coast. Farm owners can shop here for new workers.
So you can go to a market and you can buy children, and you can also go to a plantation where I did. I actually did go to cocoa plantation and pretending that I want to buy children from my own cocoa plantation. And he told me, well, yes, just tell me, what do you need? And I will get some children from Burkina Faso. And I was asking, okay, how much does it cost me? And he told me 230 euros. And that was without baggling. So you can get a children very easy, 230 euros. And then you will have a child who can work for free in your cocoa field in West Africa.
And we crave chocolate. Every German eats an average of 11 kilos of it a year. Most of the cocoa beans come from West Africa, mainly Ghana and Ivory Coast. Parents hand over their children to traffickers, forced by poverty and led astray by false promises.
When they go to the cocoa fields, most of them think that they will get paid, but they don't get paid. They are as modern slaves in these cocoa fields. So they try to run away. I've been meeting boys who ran away, who flee from the cocoa fields. They were from Mali, for instance, and they told me how they were beaten up every day and they succeeded to run away from the cocoa fields. But they are not able to go home because going home is to what? This is a matter of poverty, and the family thought they were maybe earning money at the cocoa field, so they have problems going home.
In 2001, in the International Cocoa Agreement, large firms such as Nestle and Mars agreed to ensure that child labor in the chocolate industry would be a thing of the past by 2005. In 2010, Mistrati wanted to see if that was true, but nothing had changed. The plantations were full of child slaves. He tried to get a statement from Nestle for his film, but they declined. So he started an offensive. He traveled to Switzerland, to Nestle's headquarters, to provoke a response. And it came without hesitation.
And the weeks after, I remember that I got some calls from my German broadcasters because they were contacted by the Nestle headquarters in Frankfurt. And they tried to close down the film. They were asking questions for the German television, how could we do this film and blah, blah, blah. And the my German broadcaster, they said, everything is okay, all facts are okay, so we are running and broadcasting the film, which was very important, of course, for me. But they tried to stop the film in certain ways.
The documentary, entitled The Dark Side of Chocolate, became an international success. The companies promised to improve things and announced aid projects. Mistrati wanted to show in a second film that things had indeed changed, but his application for a visa for Ivory Coast was rejected.
So it's a lot of money, a big, big business. So the government don't think that a guy like me should come to interfere with the business, because they are doing a very close cooperation with, for instance, Nestle, which is very powerful in Ivory Coast. Nestle has been in Ivory Coast for more than 50 years. So there is a close relationship between the government in Ivory Coast and Nestle on the other side.
Finally, he managed to secure an interview with Nestle. They denied all knowledge and promised to intervene. The film was screened the world over, except in Switzerland, the home of Nestle.
The Swiss broadcaster, I think, were afraid of Nestle to show this film. I do not have the proof, but they bought it. They knew before what the film was about, and they also had the copy of the film. So I think, in my opinion, I think they was afraid of Nestle in Switzerland and didn't dare to show it.
Manufacturers don't want us to see the dark images that lurk behind the glossy packaging. But as long as there's no fair trade label, it remains unclear under what conditions our chocolate is produced.
Well, today's slavery is absolutely one part of the global economy. Why are slaves today so inexpensive? Why is the price of a human being? Why are people disposable? And one of the key reasons is because of the global population explosion. In the past, there were simply not enough people to be enslaved, so the price was high. It's supply and demand. There was a low supply, demand was high, prices were high. Today, there are, we believe, about 600 million people in the world who are vulnerable to to be slaves.
Research of this kind can be dangerous. Take French journalist Guy-André Kieffer, for example. He also researched the cocoa industry in Ivory Coast. When he arranged to meet a source, he was abducted and disappeared without a trace. His body was never found.
I think that we should all be realizing now, it shouldn't be easy to see that if we leave the world up to be run by the market, it will be run by the people who are willing to be the most cruel and the most brutal. Yeah, because of course that is the way to make most money. If you don't care about if it's children making your product or slavery or you're ruining the environment or so on. I mean, of course, it's easier to make a profit from that.
We also met up with filmmaker Frank Piasecki Paulsen in Copenhagen. Another product led him to slavery. In 2007, he read in a UN report about the links between mobile phones and the war in the Democratic Republic of Congo. It involved coltan from African mines, which is essential for mobile phones.
You could make the same kind of film about the shoes that I'm wearing or the jeans or the much of the food that we are eating. For me, this is just one example of how much our way of life is depending on other people's suffering.
Paulsen took several trips to the largest and most notorious mines in eastern DRC. He spent days walking along desolate jungle trails, a treacherous undertaking. UN representatives had repeatedly warned him that this could be a suicide mission.
And this was, in a way, entering the gateways of hell. This was, I've been traveling a lot in poor countries. I've been working a lot in the slums of Nairobi and so on, and been in war, areas with armed conflict, many places, but I have never seen anything like this. This was really like hell on earth.
5 years ago, this place was only jungle. Today, between 15 to 25,000 people live and work here.
As Joseph Conrad once described torture, murder, and the craze for ivory in his novel Heart of Darkness, it's now the greed for coltan from which tantalum is one. The mines are largely controlled by mercenaries and rebel military units. Paulson managed to enter the mine shafts with his camera, penetrating deep into the dark heart of Africa that delivers the material for our smartphones.
The armed groups, what they do is that they just control the mine in that sense that everybody's going in and out have to pay tax. You know, they call it tax. So you have to pay to get in and you have to pay to get out. And the life expenses inside the mining area are so extremely high because everything is taxed, all the food, everything that is coming in, everything is carried out to the jungle from far away. So the price of a meal or something to drink is extremely high, or even a place to sleep, you have to pay so much money. So the people inside the area, they can't afford to get out because they have to use all the money they make just to survive.
A perfidious kind of modern-day slavery. In some mines, the workers receive little pay, just enough for food. Some are there voluntarily because they have no choice. Other mines keep them captive as slaves.
We would see these children come out. Some of them was, you know, it was not like small children, but it would be like boys of 11, 12, 13 years old. And they would come out of these holes looking like pieces of art because they had so much mud on their faces, and this would dry and then more would come on. So they looked like, you know, really, they looked like some statue or something. And they were doing like this with their eyes because they came out in the sun for the first time after being down there, sometimes for several days at the time. And the holes are, you know, constantly falling, collapsing, and nobody would care to dig them out. So every month people would die in one of these holes.
Like Mistrati, who investigated the dark side of chocolate, Paulson found the hardest part was getting an interview with the manufacturers. He tried to contact Nokia, a company that likes to be seen as a shining example of social responsibility.
So this is kind of weird that you cannot get, you know, for a whole year I couldn't get anybody on the phone who could just discuss the possibilities of getting an interview, which is kind of strange when it's a phone company, you know, that you can't get them on the phone.
Finally, after 12 months, a Nokia representative consented to be filmed. The result? The same excuses and promises made by Nestle. The company said it couldn't control which mines deliver the raw material, but that it would do its best. There are some 114 million mobile phones in Germany. In 2014, about 2 billion mobile phones were sold worldwide. Only the US has passed legislation forcing companies to show where they obtain what are known as conflict minerals. But the law only makes sure that the proceeds of the raw materials don't go towards funding conflicts. Slave labor isn't mentioned.
So let's think about a country like Ghana. There we have hundreds of thousands of people enslaved mining gold. That gold flows directly into the Ghanaian economy. The Ghanaian government, the government of Ghana, makes a lot of taxes from this gold. It comes out into the criminal economy, slave gold. It ends up on our fingers and on our jewelry, and no one's doing really anything about that. And that applies to lots of other countries in Africa.
Wir sprechen durchaus von Sklaverei.
We refer to slave-like conditions. One person has so much control over another person that they can force them, under certain circumstances, to work on a construction site or in a brothel. We say slave-like conditions. The legal term is human trafficking.
It used to be confined mainly to forced prostitution, but these days investigators come upon slave-like situations in Germany's industrial and service sectors. Most of those affected are here illegally. The judicial and customs authorities seem unable to control human trafficking effectively. The criminals have a well-organized network. Their victims are intimidated by violence and are unaware of their rights. They often refuse to testify.
We've
learned of cases of slavery from many different sectors in Germany: the construction industry, meat processing factories, the food service sector, and household and care services. But other sectors are also affected. A nail studio, to name one example, or peat digging, newspaper sellers.
Kevin Bales has set up a slavery index. Germany is listed as having around 10,500 people classified as slave workers. Only a small percentage come to light in official investigations.
In 2013, for example, we had 51 investigations with final results concerning human trafficking with exploitation and 425 concerning sexual exploitation. It's only a very small percentage of the human trafficking in Germany.
False promises, confiscated IDs, threats of violence. Some of the victims that get set free are deported. Victim protection remains a political problem, although the EU has issued clear guidelines.
In this EU document, for example, it says victims of human trafficking are entitled to compensation in Germany. If they fall victim here, the state must compensate them. We need a law to enforce this, but there's no such thing at the moment.
Christoph Stresser is Germany's Commissioner for Human Rights. We asked him if the question of enslavement of African migrants in southern Spain has ever been raised at a political level.
I have to admit, I'm not aware of it.
The Commissioner is supposed to represent the German government's stance on human rights worldwide. He can issue protests, but that's all.
I just came back from Indonesia. I was the first senior foreign politician who was allowed to fly to Papua New Guinea. I don't remember when I last heard Papua New Guinea mentioned in the German media. The indigenous people there are being flattened by industrial projects. They have no rights. There is a culture of impunity. I thought I'd go and see how things are for myself. And I informed our partners, and they said, yes, we're doing our best. It's the same story every day.
It's also the same story every day in the offices of German Watch. Its volunteers analyze the current numbers of human rights violations by German companies worldwide.
A survey by the University of Maastricht looked into a data bank on accusations made against companies, the business at humanrightsdatabank.org. More than 1,800 allegations against companies have been made there over the past 10 years. 87 were made against German companies, and that puts Germany at 5th place in allegations concerning human rights violations by companies in the delivery chain.
Back in 2011, the UN issued guiding principles on business and human rights, but their implementation has been delayed here in Germany. Now a national plan of action approved in 2014 is supposed to change that. But there's opposition from the business wing of the governing coalition. People there call for voluntary commitments. But haven't human rights always taken a back seat when it comes to economic or strategic interests?
No government ever leads on human rights. They always follow on human rights. And if you look at the history of governments and slavery, you discover that throughout all of human history, but especially in the last 200 years, slavery is always a second level. It's always never the first and most important issue for a government. So if there is diplomatic reasons, commercial reasons, political reasons, military reasons to ignore slavery, governments will ignore slavery.
In the 19th century, Britain was a leading example when it came to freeing people from slavery. But British firms processed cotton picked by slaves in the US. The owners said they had to buy the cheapest cotton available to remain competitive, and the government backed economic interests.
There was an enormous controversy about this. Many people were saying we should stop this. Other people were saying it's legal in that country. It was the same kinds of arguments that people will even have today about should we buy from the developing world even when people may be in bad situations? Isn't it helping them and so forth?
A look at a map of modern-day slavery reveals a shocking number of products made by slaves. Consumer goods, services and raw materials are embedded in global commodity flows, part and parcel of an international economic system from which we all benefit. Kevin Bales has referred to modern-day slaves as disposable people, cheap commodities who are denied their basic rights. He blames world politics and the companies that profit from slave labor.
I have seen the bodies of slaves who have been murdered in Brazil after their 1 month of slavery, and I've seen the bodies of slaves in India who have been killed for wanting to be free. I think it's important to say that heads of those companies where slavery is infiltrating, is finding its way into their supply chain, they are more responsible than a consumer because they are making their profits and their living from these products.